All right, so we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you all so much for coming here tonight. I'm so excited about this panel we have where we're going to discuss understanding and practicing Indigenous data sovereignty. And if I could quickly ask everybody to mute themselves as they come in, we want to be respectful of other people in this meeting and make sure that everybody can be heard that's here on the panel. All right, so my name is Madison Esposito. I am a member of the Berry Creek Rancheria of Maidu Indians of California. I'm also a co-founder of Redbud Resource Group, and you may not recognize me from our Instagram because I have been working on my medical degree for the past year, and I'm currently in my second year of earning that degree here in Minnesota at the University of Minnesota in Duluth. And I have two amazing people for our panel today. So I have Virginia Hedrick and Tammy Livermont. Virginia is currently the executive director for the California Consortium for Urban Indian Health, and she serves on the California Wellness Foundation Board of Directors. She's an enrolled member of the Yurok tribe of California and is also of Karuk descent. She has more than 15 years of experience in public health, and her work includes chronic disease prevention implementation and policy impacts of the Affordable Care Act for California tribes, as well as health research. We also have Tammy, who's an Oglala Lakota citizen, and she's in her second year of medical school at the University of Minnesota Medical School at Duluth campus. We're actually in the same cohort. She earned her BA in Native Studies and BS in Medical Biology from the University of South Dakota in 2018, and her MPH from Vanderbilt University in 2020. Prior to attending medical school, she served as the tribal liaison at the Great Plains Tribal Leaders Health Board and the public health liaison in the Great Plains Tribal Epidemiology Center, where she supported COVID-19 response across North Dakota, South Dakota, Nebraska, and Indiana. Upon completing her degree, she looks forward to serving her own tribal community by improving healthcare delivery, public health infrastructure, and as a healer. In her free time, she enjoys sewing quilts and skirts, reading, and participating in community activities. Thank you both for being here today. I'm going to stop sharing really quick so we can all see each other, and just ask you to start digging into what brought you to public health. So Virginia, let's start with you. What brought you to public health, and can you tell us a little bit more about your work with SAKUI?
Yeah, thanks, Madison. Thanks for the introduction, and really honored to be on with you both tonight, and listen to Tammy's background. What brought me to public health, the long story short, is ceremony is what brought me to public health. About a week before I was to graduate with my undergraduate degree, I was invited to attend a ceremony, which, the week before is like when you're in finals and you probably should be home studying, and tough decisions many Native students have to make, every year as we return to school or try to finish up before ceremony time. And I decided I was going to go anyway, and that I was basically had my degree. I'm going to go anyway. And I met a woman there, and I started talking about my background and passion of wanting to work in Indian country and really at the community level. That I had originally thought that I might be a psychologist and do individual work, but I really wanted to work with community and make impacts at the community level. And she was working at the California Tribal Epidemiology Center. And she's like, you have to come work here, apply here. And I was like, I don't know what public health is. I don't know what epidemiology is. I was thinking more like social work. And she's like, no, I think you have what it takes. And, you know, please, how we are as Native people. I just didn't have the words public health to put it in that box. And so that's what brought me to public health. I did work as an epidemiology program coordinator in the refounding of the California Tribal Epidemiology.
Sukui is what you do in that position.
Yeah, so I'm the executive director of the California Consortium for Urban Indian Health, and we're a small 501c3 nonprofit in Sacramento, and we work on behalf of California's 10 IHS contracted urban Indian organizations. And so these are health facilities and residential treatment facilities who are fulfilling the government's trust responsibility to provide healthcare to American Indians and Alaska Natives, regardless of where they live. We foundationally are a policy advocacy organization, and in the last 5 to 7 years have built out capacity in public health, research and evaluation, as well as a statewide domestic violence network and MMIW network. So around as it relates to research, evaluation, and data sovereignty, we do a lot of work to ensure that our communities are accurately captured in data, that were represented in state and county level reporting, which has a lot to do and directly ties into funding, policy initiatives, and sort of touches all of the work that we do. The root of it, a lot of it is getting accurate data first.
Yeah, definitely. And for anyone who missed the event that we had with Virginia last year, that was specifically about data gaps concerning Indigenous data. That's, I believe, still on our Facebook, but it's definitely on our YouTube. So it's a great presentation. Virginia, I'm always impressed by the work that you're doing at Sukui. It's such valuable work. And I recommend anyone that's here that's interested in Indigenous data sovereignty, check out that video too. And also read the report from Sukui that's about it. It's a great report. All right, Tammy, let's hear your story about how you got into public health.
Yeah, thanks, Madison. Hamataki api chante washte napi chuzapi Tammy Livermont amachiapi. Hello, relatives. It's great to be with you all tonight, and I'm very grateful to be in a space with Virginia and Maddie, and I'm just grateful for the opportunity to speak tonight and talk with everyone. So, very kind of similarly to Virginia, but I can't say it so eloquently. My introduction to public health was in undergrad. When I started undergrad, I just wanted to be a doctor. That's all I wanted to be and treat disease. And everyone always said we need native docs. So that's what I wanted to do. And I was constantly finding myself not fulfilled with the fact that we were always treating disease. And that also wasn't a familiar approach in our community. We're very much so about community-centered work, working with our entire community and initiatives in our community being informed by those that are living within our own spaces. And medicine wasn't doing that for me at that time. So I was blessed, and I still don't understand how, but I got an opportunity to work with the National Indian Health Board through a fellowship that they had established called the Tribal Youth Health Policy Fellowship. And it was through that fellowship where I finally felt like I was working in a space that one was being informed by and centered around the needs of my community and the ways in which we thought about health, the ways in which we promoted health and well-being in our community. But additionally, I learned about how you can mobilize policy and utilize policy to make systems change. And that's something that I couldn't do through my medical or clinical work. So it was really that experience. And then from then on, I've really been able to participate in different opportunities to work on policy advocacy and really see how working with Indigenous run organizations and on policy advocacy can really begin to shape systems and amend systems that maybe haven't worked for our communities historically, but to amend them in ways that best meet the needs of our people. So yeah, that's kind of my introduction. And now I'm obviously in medicine because in Indian country, sometimes it takes additional degrees or letters behind your name for people to take you seriously. But my true and honest root passion is public health and policy work.
Excellent. Yes. And as one of the people in Tammy's cohort, I can definitely emphasize her passion for policy. She is the person that we all point to whenever a policy question comes up in class. And it's gone so far to where she has taken it upon herself to work on the policy within our university, just because it needed to be done. And of course, I'm always impressed by the work that you do as well, Tammy. Can you quickly just cover how you became the tribal liaison at the Great Plains Tribal Health Board and your work in that realm of public health policy?
Sure. First, I just want to shout out that Virginia also worked in the Area Epidemiology Center in California. Not many people are aware of tribal epidemiology centers, but I think there needs to be more awareness around them and their utility for supporting public health infrastructure and data sovereignty and epidemiology related efforts within Indian country. So when I graduated, actually prior to graduating from Vanderbilt, I knew I wanted to go back to my tribe. And this was before I knew COVID was going to be declared as a public health emergency. So I actually moved from Nashville, Tennessee, back to South Dakota on March 6th of 2020. And as the public health liaison, it was a position that was centered around working with tribal leaders and tribal health directors and really supporting their efforts in public health infrastructure and health promotion, disease prevention within each of the 18 tribal communities. And I was like, this is what I want to do. I want to work with tribal leaders and people who are really rooted in the communities and aware of the needs in their communities and help support their efforts. Little did I know 2 days into my job, COVID was going to be declared as a public health emergency. And from then on, it was really like boots on the ground. And we'll kind of get into this a little bit later, but through that role, I really got to see how Indigenous data sovereignty and data ownership is so central and important to the health and well-being and health outcomes within our own communities, and how systems that have been built prior that were not built with our input or centered in our ways of knowing and thinking or our tribal sovereignty continue to fail us. And we have lots of room for improvement and ways that all the individuals on this listening to this talk tonight can, really support those efforts to support our communities.
Awesome, thank you. And I'm excited to dig into those examples later in this presentation. So we've been introduced to the panelists and heard about their amazing experience and the wonderful things they're doing. Let's talk about Indigenous data sovereignty. So the first thing we need to do before we dig into what is Indigenous data sovereignty is understand what is Indigenous data. So I know that this is kind of a mixed group of people, but many of us are familiar with the Western approach to what is data. This is almost always focused on a quantitative approach to data and evidence-based practice, randomized controlled trials, things that are kind of removed from the culture and context in which that data originates. And so I'm going to share my screen again. There we go. So here's a little breakdown of a very 10,000 foot view of what is Indigenous data. As so many of us here know, Indigenous people have always been scientists. We have always been very active in observing and working with the world around us. And these experiences, these thousands of years of experience, have informed our practice. And so our ways of knowing can be broken down into so many categories, but here's just 4 examples that I think will be relevant to this group. So first we have the land stewardship and traditional ecological knowledge. I know a lot of you here are from environmental conservation or environmental biology backgrounds. And so you're probably familiar with the ideas of land stewardship and traditional ecological knowledge. But when you look at what constitutes environmental data, you're usually seeing rainfall patterns, fire patterns, things that are quantitative, that can be mapped and can be measured. When it comes to Indigenous data, our data is our culture. And so our ways of practicing fire ecology, the way we tend plants, steward the land, how we understand food systems and work within them in ways to not only support ourselves and our nutrition, but also the environment around us. Those practices, that is our data. And then we also have traditional medicine and healing. So a lot of people that are from the medicine side of this world are probably familiar with the concepts of traditional medicine and healing. That data can be broken down into things like our relationship-based medicine, our plant-based medicine. How do we actually heal? And then also the practices of ceremony. A lot of this data in this realm specifically is sacred, and it's not accessible to people outside of the community, but it is very important data for the tribes themselves. And then we also have things like traditional cosmology and storytelling. These are our creation stories, our traditional songs, our coming of age ceremonies. These are the practices that center us not only within our communities, but also within our place. And then there's also the nation building practices that are seen in different Native communities. These include things like our implicit sovereignty that is within every tribal nation, regardless of what the federal government or state government categorizes us as. There's also our relationship-based governance structures and our practices like gift giving. And so, since many of us are familiar with non-Indigenous ways of viewing data, and then also a lot of us are familiar with the Indigenous side of data, you can see that there's some big differences here. The top one being the quantitative nature of non-Indigenous approaches to data, and the very qualitative side of data that is the Indigenous side of data. A lot of times people describe Native data and ways of doing science as practice-based evidence instead of evidence-based practice. This is because we've been practicing these methods for thousands of years and we know they work. We don't need to go the other way around. And this facilitates and necessitates a different framework and perspective when it comes to how to collect, disseminate, and analyze data. And this is why you need an Indigenous data sovereignty framework to successfully practice and collaborate with Native communities when you're doing any kind of data collection, programming, or research within Native communities. Okay, so we understand what's Indigenous data. Let's start understanding what's data sovereignty. And so the general definition of data sovereignty is something I pulled from the Purdue University. And they define data sovereignty as the understanding that data which are stored outside of an organization's host country are still subject to the laws in the country where the data are stored. So they provide an example, which is a Canadian cloud service provider that has their main office, including sales, marketing, accounting, and operations in Canada, but have their customer service call centers located in the UK. Certain personal information about accounts must be sent to the UK in order for them to contact citizens or clients and provide support. It's a pretty basic example. It's not very exciting. It might not be applicable to everybody here. But the main message that's trying to be said here is that the data is under geopolitical jurisdiction. It matters where the data is, not who that data comes from. And this is a huge critique of this general approach to data sovereignty, is that it separates the data from the communities. And this leads to so many problems that we're going to dig into later. One of the biggest ones being, if you separate the data from the community, it's not going to add value back to that community. You're ending up doing an extractive practice of taking things from a community without giving back. And then we have Indigenous data sovereignty. So the U.S. Indigenous Data Sovereignty Network, great organization, highly recommend going to their website. Someone will drop a link to that website in just a second in the chat. So they define Indigenous data sovereignty as the right of Native nations to govern the collection, ownership, and application of their own data. This means that voices and perspectives from the Native community that you're collecting data from, with, or in collaboration with is in every piece of your programming and research, from asking what the main goal of the research is to how it's going to be stored and disseminated. You are always in communication with the tribal nations you're extracting this data from. And so we have these great definitions, and I would like to hear from our panelists about how they would define Indigenous data sovereignty within their work. So whoever wants to go first. Oh.
I could take a shot at it. I mean, I think it's so many things, Maddie. And, you know, I know we had a whole presentation on sort of addressing data gaps, but I can't not talk about data sovereignty without talking about like what is data, like who's Indigenous, right? Like who are you counting in the first place is often a question Sakui will ask. You know, the right to sort of govern, for us to say like who we believe meets the definition, right? And there's all these federal definitions of who's American Indian, who's Alaska Native, who's IHS eligible, who's enrolled, who's not enrolled. What does it mean to be self-identified? What does it mean to be mixed race according to the census? What does it mean to be mixed race according to your own self? How does that play out in data? So when I think about data sovereignty, I always start there with, you know, communities really defining for themselves who's included in our data, who counts by our standards, what's our definition of American Indian and Alaska Native, what's our definition of Indigenous, who are we talking about in the first place, who gets left out in the process, how is that harmful to our data collection, how is it not harmful? You know, so I think I always start there on like, really at the beginning of like your data collection before you even asked anybody a question or pulled any data from the census or pulled any data from, you know, existing data set, is like making that first decision, which many people don't give a lot of thought to. We're so used to seeing racial breakdowns as just being like Black, white, Asian, and other. And then we're like, wait, are we other? I don't feel very other. I feel like American Indian, and where's that? And how do I tease that out? Or maybe I'm the mixed race, that's where I fall. And that's how it can be really complicated. So it's not just about like, once we have the data, it's all of those pieces you mentioned in the beginning, like the design, the study design, the data collection design. Many states do a horrible job in race data collection, and you know, we're still in a pandemic. If that's news to anybody, I'm sorry, but we're still living in a pandemic. COVID's still a very real thing. And, you know, Tammy mentioned, you know, starting out just days before the pandemic started. And so I can't not think about COVID-19. Very early in the pandemic, data wasn't coming in clear enough to see who was being hit hardest by this, right? And it wasn't important necessarily at the time to lawmakers and legislators who wanted to get their own vaccine. And so we really started having to hit this data lens of, it matters to us. We're seeing on the ground that there's a disproportionate impact of COVID-19 to communities of color. And they were saying, yeah, well, we're not seeing that in India and then the American Indian community. Like, you're just not popping up in the data. So these are like very real issues that we're confronted with on a very regular basis, where when Indigenous communities and Indigenous people aren't brought to the table to help make some of those decisions, by the time the data is done and collected, we've already been missed. So those are just my first like reactions when I see like, what are the differences and what does it mean? So often we'll be brought in to look at data and see like there's something really missing. Like, they worked with the state on a maternal child health report, and we were looking at how many American Indian babies they had reported in the state. And I'm like, this just doesn't feel right. This number's really small. Can we look at like, how do you count, like who counts as an Indian baby? And the only Indian babies that counted were those born to Indian mothers. So like, if your dad was American Indian, not an Indian baby. Like, we were like, what? How is the race of the father not determined in this health like healthy infant baby study. This is wild. And when we did that, our baby count almost doubled. And then suddenly we had statistically significant numbers to say anything about. So, sometimes you can make those catches and sometimes it's just too late. Like, whoops, we never asked that question.
I so many of those points are like, it's bringing back a lot of memories from COVID and this idea of tribes not being able to get their data, or there being data available on our community, but then tribes not being allowed to own or protect that data to use to protect their community. So we can get into that later. But I think and if you're not familiar, I think people should familiarize themselves with the entire process and movement also for tribal IRBs, because I always think about tribal IRBs, especially where I grew up, as like the beginning point of what Indigenous data sovereignty means in Western frameworks or like Western ways of thinking now, when you come into our communities. So to me, Indigenous data sovereignty at the starting point is there being data that's informed and wanted and needed by Indigenous communities. I think when data is being acquired or extracted for someone else's benefit to gain, rather than it being informed by the needs of our communities, you've already kind of missed the mark on what's important. So I think at the beginning of what Indigenous data sovereignty is really the data that is out there being informed by the needs of tribal communities and really the needs of whatever we see to be fit. Maddie had talked about, getting data on tribal communities. And I think kind of flipping that narrative and saying, what do tribal communities want? What data do we want? What type of research do we want or need for our communities? Not the opposite. And I think that approach in itself is centering your work in Indigenous data sovereignty, because you're allowing your work to be led by the needs of our communities rather than your wants or needs leading whatever data you need extracted from our communities.
Yeah, very well put, Tammy. I think that there's a lot of overlap with the Indigenous data sovereignty framework and community-based participatory research. And if anyone in the audience isn't familiar with that concept of community-based participatory research, it's basically building everything about the work you're doing based on the community. Instead of coming to the community saying, I am going to do this thing and it's going to benefit you, you come in and say, I have these expertise. How can I be of use to you? Like, what can I do with what I have to better your community? Lead me. And then also there was a question that popped up in the chat. If Tammy, can you explain further what an IRB is?
Sure. So IRBs are institutional review boards. You'll find these academic institutions, anywhere you're really doing any type of research, especially like human subjects research. All of your research has to go through an IRB. And so tribes specifically have an institutional review board, or some tribes have institutional review boards in which any research that's done within their community or on their tribal members or includes tribal members should go through their tribal IRB so that they can approve it and inform the entire process of the research that's happening within their community.
Yeah, I think that this is a great segue into my next question for you both, which is talking about the nuance between a non-Indigenous approach to data sovereignty and the Indigenous approach to data sovereignty. I know you've both worked in Western and non-Indigenous realms and in Indigenous realms. So what are the big differences that you've seen there? I think that the IRB is a great place to start. Like, what are the differences between a native-led, like tribal-based IRB and like the IRB that they have at the University of Minnesota?
Yeah, I mean, I think that when you think about traditional research that might come from a university or an institution like a university, the goal is driven by like a single researcher or a single research question, right? And that sort of like hails as like the golden standard that everybody's trying to answer this research question. And it's like, it doesn't matter what our answer is, or we think we know what the answer is going to be. And so we're going to work really hard to achieve that. Sort of in an Indigenous data model or an Indigenous research model is really a collective accountability and responsibility to a community, right? So it's like in our work in public health, we have to walk very carefully and ensure that everything we do is responsive to the community, is accountable to the community, is also reflective to the community in a way that is helpful, right? So at Sequoia, a lot of times we first will look at research from a strength-based place. What are the good things we can say that we've learned in this process? What are we doing really well? Indigenous mothers in California are breastfeeding at 2 weeks longer than all other races. That's incredible. And then we will get to where we talk about how we are still suffering from the highest rates of sudden infant death syndrome than all other races and have been consistently for like more than 30 years. So it's like that, finding that balance and figuring out where to center the voice and how do we do this appropriately? How do we do it respectfully? And also knowing that I'm not getting an answer, right? Like sometimes we have a research question and we're not getting an answer. It's just becoming a not clear, or the answer that we're getting doesn't feel reflective and responsive to what the Indigenous community is feeling, and thinking. And so we don't immediately think they're wrong, the community's wrong. We think something is wrong with the way we've done this. Something is wrong with the data. Somehow we have missed a step. There's a question we didn't ask. There's something, so it's like this humility from like an Indigenous data sovereignty perspective, an Indigenous researcher, there's a sense of humility that the data is not supreme. The research question is not the supreme entity, right? It's the community. It's like a living subject of people. And so you don't hold this over, like this isn't the gold standard. We go back to the community, we review what we've done. And it's not about like being unethical with the data. It's not about changing the data. It's not about, so I don't want like my words to get like land in the wrong way with people. It's just about being critical of our own lens, being critical of Western models being applied in a very like traditional cultural sense. Because we're all walking that line, right? Like we're all using Excel, we're using SPSS, like we're using these like Western models to sometimes look at things that are very rooted in culture, that are like since the beginning of time. And so there's like an inappropriateness to that at times where it's like, let me pause for a minute and think about this differently. Let me talk to my auntie. Let me talk to my uncle about this. And sometimes those are the key informant interviews where you go back to the data and you're like, I see what I've missed. I see what I've missed. Or this is the answer and it's not what I expect. I'm interpreting my results wrong. This is how we talk about it. So I think like I'm trying to like share that, like the side by side of those and also like the similarities. We're all sitting down at the best computer we have to do the data analysis, with statisticians, these things are not left or pulled off, put to the wayside.
I don't feel like I have hardly anything to add to that because, I mean, I just feel like it doesn't matter where you go. Virginia and I have never met, and like everything that she says resonates with my community and really the framework in which we approach data or research or any sort of learning in our communities. I will say one of the biggest differences between I think like Western frameworks of sovereignty of data and of research and Indigenous communities is just a mindset and a worldview. And that's not something I can teach. That's not something any of us can really teach, is the Indigenous worldview, but just recognizing that we see the world in a very different way. And Virginia talked about, the difference in a Western research project, how your PI or your person at the top is kind of your supreme leader. When I do research, and the way that I've been taught to do research are the elders and the people in the community are the people leading my research. It's not me. It's not my wants or needs. It's really the elders, their knowledge, their ideas for what are necessary, and their voices are the supreme like centered voice within the research that we do. So I think that like when we do research in larger institutions, you're looking for your PhDs or your people with these Western degrees that seem to be legit or know everything. And in our communities, it's not always the people with the highest degree that are the experts. A lot of the times, and most of the times, it's our elders and those people who really have lived within the community, bear those cultures and knowledges that not all of us have. So again, like it's a different way of seeing the world, and it's just not something that can be taught, and it's hard to explain as well. But yeah.
I think the only other thing I might add, and I know Tammy, you're going to be familiar with this too, is in consultation with any of our agencies that Sakui works on behalf of, our urban Indian organizations, or even when a tribal health program or a tribe seeks consultation from Sakui before engaging in research, we always recommend and will provide TA on the development of a data sharing agreement that puts the data ownership to the community. And at the very least, like the tribal council, the tribal government, the health board, and advisory board of community. Usually it's like a very structured board, which is I'm giving these like types of examples. We want to know something about obesity in the community. So we're just going to go ahead and put this fact sheet out. Our data sharing agreement dictates that we cannot do that. That's not the purpose for which we pulled that data. And if we found something interesting, we have to say why we were looking at it in the first place, because we never said we were going to look at it, and go back and get approval back from the Indian entity, from the tribal agency, before releasing a fact sheet or report of any data that was outside the scope of the original design data pool.
I just want to provide an example of that and how that approach differs so much when you're looking at Indigenous run organizations versus not. From my time at the Epidemiology Center in the Great Plains. So our Epi Center worked very similarly. There was always a data agreement. All of the reports that we provided were for the tribe and informed by the tribes. When it came to COVID data, the state was collecting that data, but the tribes had to sign data sharing agreements that they didn't own the data and that the state did. So it was really just surprising to see that states, even with large native populations and a large amount of tribes, still approach gathering data in this way of like, we're the state, we own this data, this isn't yours, you can't utilize it, you have to tell us exactly what. So I think your data sharing agreement example is just such a great example of how like tribally run organizations approach data and data sovereignty in a very different way than like state or federally run agencies that maybe haven't adopted these practices or haven't made a concerted effort to center their practices in Indigenous data sovereignty. And really that not prohibited, but lessened the ability of tribes to respond in the way that we needed to for our people, because these other agencies just could not see the importance of tribes owning that data and having access to that data and informing what the release of that type of data on their communities looked like. So it's just a very stark difference. Thanks for that example.
Yeah, thank you both for sharing all of that excellent insight. On this next slide here, I'm going to basically try to sum up what you have both been talking about. So let me just get that back up. Okay, so we've really touched on what the differences are between these frameworks, and I think it comes down to two major differences. The first is that general approaches to data sovereignty are predicated on a geopolitical data jurisdiction model, which is where the data physically is who rules that data. And so this is getting back to what we've all been talking about this extractive practice of data collection. You go to a place, you get the data that you want, and then you leave. And that community is not involved with the data anymore. They're just numbers on a piece of paper. It's very dehumanizing, and it removes the data from all of the really important culture and context that you need to have around that data to really understand what's going on. In an indigenous approach to data sovereignty, you have jurisdiction of that data under the tribal and indigenous communities from which that data originates. With that, you have such a bigger, more holistic view of that data. It's going to be more effective for you, and it's going to be more meaningful for that community. And then the other big difference is how this data is created. So the overwhelming majority of data about Native people is not created by Native people, and it's not made to serve Native people. And I think that this is a big part of what both Tammy and Virginia have been talking about is, what is the purpose of this data we're creating? Who is it supposed to serve? And the biggest difference I see between the indigenous data sovereignty approach and the non-indigenous, more general data sovereignty approach is that in a general approach, the data is meant to serve the people who are collecting it. It's to, forward a amorphous idea of what is known about health, science, ecology, whatever fields you're collecting that data for. In an indigenous approach, that data is there to help the communities it comes from. It's there to serve the Native people. And so when you have an indigenous approach to data sovereignty, the data is collected, evaluated, and distributed using an indigenous perspective, and it creates value for the indigenous communities. This means that data is going to be just suffused with cultural context, historical context, feedback. It's living data instead of just removed, stagnant, and possibly not even capturing what you were trying to capture with your research to begin with. So I think those are just a summary of what the differences are here. And so the shortcomings of a general approach to data sovereignty have been identified by non-Indigenous people, and an approach called open data sovereignty has been proposed, which I think has some very good points. And I'm going to talk about what those points are, and then I'm going to talk about how Indigenous data sovereignty expands and improves them. So this is called the FAIR principles, right? And these are kind of what outline open data sovereignty. These principles were created by gofair.org. There's a link in the bottom right corner, and somebody can drop that into the chat for you to read more fully about these principles, but I'm going to quickly go over them. So the idea of fair open data is that it's findable. So metadata and data should be easy to find for both humans and computers. It's accessible. So once the user finds the required data, they need to know how the data can be accessed. It's interoperable. So the data usually needs to be integrated with other data and interoperate with applications or workflows for analysis, storage, and processing. Like Virginia was saying, our very favorite program, Excel, needs to be able to use the data. Can't tell you how many hours I spend on Excel. And then the data also needs to be reusable. So metadata and data should be well described so that they can be replicated and or combined in different settings. These all on their surface seem attractive at first glance, but can cause real problems within Native communities. One of the biggest issues being that these principles are focused on facilitating easy and wide distribution of data, but they miss the power differentials in historical context that surrounds Indigenous communities. Considering that, like I said, the vast majority of data collected about our communities is used in a non-Indigenous space, and it's not employed for Indigenous benefit, these principles can actually pose a greater threat to Native communities than a benefit. So thankfully, the wonderful people at the Indigenous Data Sovereignty different Indigenous data sovereignty advocacy groups have come up with ways to expand these principles and adapt them to better support the sovereignty of Native nations in the world of data science. And from that, we get the CARE principles. So recognizing that the FAIR principles are great, but to be successful when it comes to working within Indigenous communities, you need to adapt it with the CARE principles. So the link for this is also provided in the bottom of the slide, and then someone can drop it into the chat. This is from GITA Global, which is the Global Indigenous Data Alliance, which is an alliance between multiple Indigenous communities across the globe, not just specifically Native Americans. And so let's go over what these principles are. So first, there's collective benefit, which is that the data ecosystem should be designed and function in ways that enable Indigenous people to drive and benefit from that data. It should have authority to control. So Indigenous people's rights and interests in Indigenous data must be recognized, and their authority to control such data should be empowered. There should be responsibility. That is, that those working with Indigenous data have a responsibility to share how these data are used to support Indigenous people's self-determination and collective benefit. And of course, it needs to be ethical. Indigenous people's rights and well-being should be the primary concern at all stages of the data life cycle and across the data ecosystem. This is really drilling at that issue of who is the data for, who does it serve? And it should serve the Native community, the Indigenous communities that it comes from. That should be the purpose of all of our work and research. And so to put some more context and to get into your minds about how these many different principles can actually be used in the real world, I asked the panelists to provide me with some examples of Indigenous sovereignty within their work. So we're going to start with Virginia. You shared with me the California Reducing Disparities Project, in which SACUI holds pre and post test data from American Indian Alaska Native youth, measuring cultural connectedness collected from multiple urban Indian organization project sites. Can you give us a little more context on this project and explain the ways in which it strengthens Indigenous data sovereignty? And I'm going to drop a link to your work in the chat too, so people can see that.
Sure, thanks, Maddie.
Awesome.
So SACUI is really honored to be a part of this work. We call it the CRDP work. And that's really just where the funding comes from through the state of California. And, you know, many people in Indian country know this, right? Like, you know, something is working really well and you're looking for the right funding opportunities to make it happen. So this funding opportunity comes from the state that really wants to look at how to improve mental health of young people, right? And so they're doing it across many racial sectors, and American Indian community is one of them. And we know that GONA's Gathering of Native Americans as a curriculum, as a model in California, has been really effective in improving the mental health and wellness and really community and cultural connectedness in the places where GONAs have been instituted. And so to measure this, our different sites, so different urban Indian organizations, do pre and post tests with youth before they engage in a GONA. And it'll ask them a little bit about themselves, and then it'll ask them about really getting a feel for traditional practices. How often are they praying? When do they pray? How often are they praying? What types of medicines have they used? What are they interested in using? And then we do a follow-up survey. I think it's 6 months post the GONA, to ask those same set of questions. And from that, we can see positively that post GONA, youth are more engaged in cultural activities. So that's some short summary of the project. This is really vulnerable data. We're asking really the heart of the community. We're asking communities, most vulnerable, youngest community members, to share really private, sensitive information. And let's say we have some youth who have limited opportunities for sort of cultural engagement, and their survey is very vulnerable to them. They're opening up and sharing that, you know, they're not engaged in these types of ways. And so that's a really precious piece of information. And while it's just a paper survey, we know as an Indigenous agency, Indigenous-led agency, that it takes a lot. It takes a lot for anybody, and it takes a lot for a young person to answer a set of questions that are very deep to who they are as an Indigenous person. And so we want to treat that really carefully. I'll say that the funding as it comes from the state requires that we release our data back to the state. Since it's funded by the state, they own it. And we have said absolutely not. We might be getting the funding, the lead agency in the Bay Area might be getting funding, but we don't own the data. The data will always be owned by that individual, first and foremost, by that young person who shared a piece of them with us. So we can't give it back to a state entity where we would have no control over what would happen to it, right? So one, you asked how it strengthens data sovereignty. One, I think it asserts data sovereignty, right? So we're asserting data sovereignty, Indigenous data sovereignty in this way that we're unlike, I shouldn't say we're unlike, maybe unlike other communities, we have been significantly harmed by poor research habits. And so we're not going to release the data. What do you want to know? We'll tell you what we've learned, and we'll share with you what we've learned in our process, the good and the bad, but we're not releasing our raw data to you. We'll share manuscripts with you. We will do any and everything that you need to know about our project, we'll share with you, but we can't give you the data. So that's like one layer of data protection. But then as it relates to Sakui, we're not asserting that we own the data. Each of the communities that have participated in the GONA and whose young people have participated in the GONA, they own their data. So before we put forward a manuscript, before we release any publication, we go to each of those communities and say, these are the findings. These are the assertions that we want to make. Is this in alignment with your community? Have we misstepped? Have we misinterpreted something here? And we have had communities say, we would rather not be named in the report. So can you just say a community from Central California? Okay, no problem. And I'm just using that as an example. And in a way in which a community can say, I'm comfortable with using our data, but we don't want to be named. And you'll see this in like various tribal communities too, who will say, don't name us. We don't want to, one, be targeted or to be ostracized for whatever the findings might be. And we also don't want to be open to more folks coming in to engage with research with us. We're at limited capacity. So there's a number of reasons why a community might not want to release their data. And I see Darlene Franco is on, who has been really integral in our GONA work and just does really incredible work with the Fresno American Indian House. So she knows exactly what I'm talking about here. And so that's sort of like the community process. So one might say like Sakui is an Indigenous-led agency. And so, you know, we own the data, but I said very early on, we're also accountable to our communities, and our community agencies are accountable to their communities. So this is like a layered approach to data sovereignty. It's not enough for Virginia Hedrick to say, yeah, that's good, I sign off. And you know, we can do that to a certain level after we've received community sign off on a piece. Then we can say like, yes, this has been community reviewed and approved. And so now we can use it in a myriad of ways that have been approved by the community. So the CRDP project is a really great example of that. Thank you for asking about it, Maddie. And you know, Darlene, please feel free to chime in the chat of if any of this is bringing up any pieces for you on how data is collected at Fresno American Indian Health, one of our member programs, or anything that you think might enrich the conversation. So thanks, Maddie.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for sharing all of that great information about the work you're doing. I think it's very valuable for the people in our audience to see how these principles are applied in real life examples. And I also just want to double what Virginia was saying for everybody that's watching right now. Please feel free to interact with the chat. We're taking questions throughout the whole thing. We will have, you know, specific time at the end for a more open Q&A, but if you have questions right now, please feel free to drop some. And I see that Taylor has one here. What would you say to researchers who feel pressured by time constraints or other issues to skip steps in this process?
Yeah, that's a big one. And we all get crunched by time, right? So I would just say, take a deep breath, buckle up. Like, this is working in Indian country. And I do a whole separate training on like how to work in Indian country. And like, I've literally told people, you might show up on the day you thought you had a meeting and the whole community is a pause. We've lost somebody, we're in mourning, everything's closed, and the day is shifted. And that's something that happens. And so I think that's part of like approaching work in Indian country with a sense of cultural humility and understanding that sort of that old ways of knowing, sometimes we're driven by a timeline we don't know. And so, it's nobody wants to be off on the time. Nobody wants to ask for an extension. Nobody wants to miss a deadline. Sometimes you miss you change your approach, right? Your outcome, your expected outcome changes to what you have right now. What can I say? How many participants? What are the demographics of what I've done? And how can I present that as my results? And then say, I'm still in community development on the analysis of the data. There's a number of ways to look at it, and to sort of meet your metrics where you need to. And also just know that that's part of working in Indian country and Indigenous data sovereignty, is knowing that sometimes our timelines get put in our pocket.
Great points all around, Virginia. I know before we started going live, this was a conversation we were already having because of the work that Tammy's been doing. And so I'm going to shift really quickly over to Tammy and the story she provided with me before this meeting. So Tammy, you shared some insights into your work while you were at the Great Plains Tribal Epidemiology Center during the COVID-19 pandemic. During which you educated state and Indian Health Service employees about the legal precedent upholding the support for sharing data with tribes and how they could transition ownership of that data to tribes. And I heard that this was a very active conversation. So can you give us a little more context on this work and explain the ways in which this strengthened Indigenous sovereignty? And I'm going to drop the link you provided me to the that little article about this so people have that to reference as well.
Sure, yeah. So this is stepping into a little bit different area of Indigenous data sovereignty and dealing with state and federal entities. And what does it look like, from a tribal healthcare, tribally run organization, we can control those policies or the data sharing agreement, like Virginia said, and control, the data that's shared with the state or whoever the funder is. But the reality of our public health infrastructure in our country is that our communities were left out of a lot of that early on. So there's a lot of progress to be made when it comes to investment in public health infrastructure nationally, but especially within Indian country. When it comes to collecting disease data, all of our data is housed and stored within state or federal IHS data banks within CDC, IHS, HHS, or states that tribes have to beg for or ask for to have access to their own data. And so when the COVID pandemic was declared, me being a brand new master's student walking into the epicenter, I was like, all right, I know that the tribes need dashboards of their data to see what's happening within each of the communities. And everyone was like, we don't get that. We can't get that. The states own it. And I was like, wait, what? Our tribes don't have access to that data? And we didn't. The reality was our tribes, as well as our tribal epicenter, did not have access to that data in a timely fashion. And it was also very aggregated when we did get it delayed. And so obviously I was like, there's got to be more. There's got to be something. We haven't had this. There's got to be some precedent. And there is. So within the public health infrastructure system, within public law, there is a law that declares tribal epidemiology centers and tribal nations as public health authorities. And as a public health authority, you are able to receive public health data with that is not protected by HIPAA. So essentially, you can get access to data just like maybe I test positive for COVID in a state that I'm not from. That state that I tested positive in can send that data to the state that I live in, because both of those states are public health authorities by federal law. The reality is tribal nations and tribal epidemiology centers are the same, carry that same legal um, status that states do, but we're not treated the same. So we're often going to these agencies begging for data for our communities that we need and that are essential for responding to public health emergencies or just setting priorities for the next 5-10 years for efforts that we're going to work on within our communities. We're going to states or the federal government begging for that data that is rightfully ours and there is legal precedent for. So we constantly found ourselves bringing our lawyers, bringing people to the table and saying, law exists. There are multiple lawsuits historically that uphold the fact that tribes and tribal epicenters are public health authorities and can have access, should and can have access to this data. And we were found stonewalled very, very often. And I know in California, I talked to some people out there and you were successful in some ways, but there are these barriers of systems that have been built not for us, not by us, and not considering tribal sovereignty and really bypassing what the law says when it comes to really upholding or mobilizing what is Indigenous data sovereignty when it comes to public health and health response. So the report that Maddie shared in the chat is actually a result of a lot of work by tribal epicenters across the nation saying, look, we and the tribes in our area can't get access to this data and it's problematic. The law says that we should have access to this data. So the Government Accountability Organization, I think the GAO, I'm sure we're all familiar with the GAO, actually published a report last fall detailing the fact that the Department of Health and Human Services, states, the CDC, the Indian Health Service, all need to do better when it comes to data sharing. And I think I would take it a step beyond what GAO did and really center their data collection in Indigenous data sovereignty and putting funding and resources into building public health infrastructure in our communities. So we don't have to go ask the state of South Dakota or the state of California for our data. They can come to us if they need additional data to talk about the state of the COVID pandemic in their state or whatever. So that's really a higher level, like federal state example of how the systems are failing Indigenous data sovereignty right now. But really how we and our advocacy within the epicenter in conjunction with and working with tribal leaders, tribal health directors and people like that really began to bring a light to this situation, put a narrative out there that was true to our communities and that is so central to improving health within our communities, that I think goes masked or people are just unaware of broadly.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Tammy. Yeah, it blows my mind all the time that you don't also have a JD after your name with your insane depth of knowledge about Native law and policy. But thank you both so much for sharing these experiences and talking about how they were successful, what kind of obstacles you ran into along the way. And I really quickly, before we open up for like a wider Q&A with the audience, cultivating allyship to further strengthen Indigenous sovereignty is a cornerstone of our work here at Redbud. And I was wondering, what are some ways that the researchers, students, and other professionals in our audience tonight can better support Indigenous data sovereignty in their work?
I can take a stab at it since Virginia's kind of went first every time. I really think that we've talked about it earlier and really central to Indigenous data sovereignty is having it be community informed. So the work that you do, you don't go in and say, I'm a student, I want to do this research. Maddie mentioned earlier, say, I'm a student and I'm interested in supporting your community. how can I do that? First part of any sort of Indigenous data sovereignty and working with any tribe in this manner, or centering any of your work in data sovereignty, is relationships. Until you have relationships and meaningful relationships with our communities, that's going to be very difficult. So first step, create relationships, build meaningful relationships, and then from there, offer your support from a perspective of not for your benefit, but for the benefit and centered in the needs and wants of that community.
Yeah, I think Tammy gave a perfect answer. It reminded me of growing up. My grandmother, I had the privilege of just living really close to my grandmother, who was born speaking Yurok first, and was among the last, like, handful of people who were fluent in Yurok, but it was her first language. And I didn't know until years later, till I was in college, what my experience was. Growing up, we would have linguists and anthropologists come, and they would bring her like a box of chocolates or a box of candy, and they would visit her and record for like hours and hours. And she always thought they were very kind. They always brought, there was this person who always brought a pie, like, oh, he brought a pie. The doctor brought a pie. And I'm like, Grandma, he's paying you in pies for his PhD. Like, that's not right. That's not right. Like, nobody else would allow this. And she's like, oh, that's not what's happening. And I'm like, yeah, I've been out like in the real world now. And he's published. And most of the things he's published is the information and the data that you've given him, with almost no credit to his direct source. And so there came this time as a community that we were like, enough of these people coming to our couch and recording and doing their own linguistic dictionaries written in a format that nobody will ever understand. Let's have grandmother publish a conversational dictionary in her own words and what she thinks is important that people learn. And she thought it was really important that people learn whole sentences, no more words. And we can't talk about this like linguists talk about it. We have to talk about it how we as people talk, right? And so then she had native students from Humboldt State come and work with her and create this dictionary where she was the primary author, right? So that's like a really good example of how you center community first. Did she write this book entirely on her? No, she didn't. But she's the primary author. She's the only one listed on the cover. And on the inside, there's acknowledgements of contributors and researchers and funders and all of the things, right? So I think that's just in my own life. We haven't spoke about language, but research happens all over the place. It's not always health-based, right? Sometimes it's traditional ecological knowledge, sometimes it's language, it's all of these pieces, right? So that's an example of how research can be extractive. And I don't think that the gentleman who brought her pies was malicious. I don't think that his intent, and certainly she didn't think that he was coming with bad intentions. She felt like he was doing important work, preserving our language, and she would give information to anybody who wanted it in an effort to preserve language. But it was bad practice and bad form, right? It doesn't center the community. It doesn't center the person giving their knowledge or a piece of themselves. So I'm not sure like where I went with that, but that's what you said, Tammy, reminded me of that.
I think you went to a great place with it. I think that's such a perfect example of what we're talking about when we're talking about centering the community and Indigenous data sovereignty. Okay, and Tammy, did you have anything further to add? I'm going to open it up to group questions soon.
I'll just say we have a parallel story within my own community, and this idea of revitalizing language or saving our languages, not out of bad intention, I don't believe in the beginning, but then organizations now profiting off of saving our language, and how even if your intentions don't seem bad in the beginning, I think anything that is rooted in Indigenous knowledge shouldn't just implicitly benefit our communities, but when it comes to profits, it's so important for those profits to benefit our communities and not people who maybe felt like are giving me white savior vibes. Maybe that's not the appropriate thing to call them, but really, like, anything based in our knowledge and our ways of knowing should benefit our communities at the end of the day. Um, and, there are examples of language revitalization where people are profiting off of our language and our elders that spent time and did share that knowledge with them, that are now gone. And we're not, we don't seem to have any ground for retaining those records. And someone else now owns it. Not that the intentions in the beginning were bad, but how it's turning out, um, is very sad. And I don't think our elders that shared that knowledge would be happy with that type of approach. So that's a great example, Virginia. And I'm sure there are so many examples of language revitalization efforts that maybe didn't start with bad intentions, not benefiting our communities wholly.
Excellent. Yeah, thank you for adding that further context there, Tammy. And we're starting to get some questions in the chat, and we are moving on to like just an open general Q&A moment here. So whatever questions you have, feel free to post them, and we're going to try to get to as many as we can. So the first question is from Sam Young. For digital data that might exist in multiple places, so it can be input to models, maps, etc., how can we manage storage in a way that doesn't separate data from community?
Yeah, and I see David's questions really similar. So since we're speaking about language, I think I can use this example. UC Berkeley has is rooted in historical land grab, genocide, like a bunch of things. So let's start there. I'm not like saying UC Berkeley is the best. There's a lot of work to do. But in terms of language revitalization for the Yurok tribe, UC Berkeley maintains a website that is like a whole index of everything that Berkeley has on Yurok language. And a lot of it is available to the public. So you can search like Yurok language dictionary and the Berkeley website is going to come up, but not all of it. In fact, some of the language website is password protected, and many tribal members have the password, and you can get the password really easily from the Yurok tribe's language department, and they'll give the password to any tribal member or really anyone who's asking for it in a good way. So I think that's one way to protect information, make it accessible, and give it back to community, and give tribes some ownership, right? So the tribe has the password to the portions of the language that we don't want open to the public, words that we don't want misused or misrepresented. There's a lot of conversation around like maps as they relate to the high country and our prayer places. So some people are like, oh, we'll make the map available and then we'll all know like the places to avoid. And it's like, well, yeah, that's thinking that everyone's really good-hearted. We're still battling like looters, right? Like people who come to our historical cemeteries along the ocean and are looting our people, like bones, are actual people. So you have to be really careful. Like I guess the recommendation here isn't like, let's release a map of like the best place to gather Angelica root, because we don't want everybody just like commodifying and gathering all of our Angelica root in California. But so like finding that place to like, how do you make information that you've gathered accessible to community, responsive to the community, isn't like as straightforward as I'm saying it is, but it's possible.
Great. Thank you so much, Virginia. I think that really puts a good perspective on how to do this practically. And that's kind of applicable to any practice or discipline. And I think that, and tell me if you think there's further nuance that's necessary here, but I think what you're saying about having the tribes control who accesses the data really fits what David is asking about here when it comes to the activities of the California Native Plant Society and how they want to best share their data with local tribes. Do you think that, a framework that has password protection and is controlled by the tribes would be the best way to do that as well?
I mean, yeah, I do. I think it's one step, right? It's imperfect because we know that one almost we're existing in a framework where we're talking about federally recognized tribes, right? So in California, we have such a large number of tribal communities that are not federally recognized. And so who still should have access, right? Like the Ohlone people of the San Francisco Bay, the Chumash people, the Gabrielino Tongva people have also been victims of the same extractive behavior and don't have these same mechanisms that, say, the potentially I do as a Yurok person. I, have family members who are not members of the tribe. And so like how might that limit their access? So, it's imperfect. It's a step. There might be other better processes, community-based organizations who can help link community to sort of these password protected sites. So yeah.
Great. And then David is adding some more context down here saying that locality data on plants is important to botanists, but we at CNPS recognize that sometimes we don't want to be precise in where they are to be found. I think that's another great way to make this data more accessible, but still protecting and recognizing the importance of these places and plants to the tribal nations that they are housed within and are important to. And let's see here, there's another question in the chat. How can tribes negotiate rights to their data? What should they ask for? Tammy, you kind of have direct experience with this if you want to take that on.
Yeah, so I think this depends on if the data already exists or if it's new data. As I talked about earlier, I think tribal IRBs are a really great mechanism for tribes negotiating their ownership of their data from the beginning of research happening. I think for data that already exists, and I will say I have most of my experience and I belong to a federally recognized tribe. So I have a very biased perspective when it comes to federal law and tribal sovereignty and that legal precedent that federally recognized tribes have. But I think tribes should always use their tribal sovereignty in whichever way they would like to express it for their best interest. And tribes can do that in many different ways. But I think honestly, from a perspective of someone who isn't a tribal leader, I can't say how my own tribe or any other tribe should go to a state and say, hey, we want to own our data. But knowing that tribes do have the authority to do that, and there is legal precedent that gives federally recognized tribes that power and authority, is important to recognize. I think for organizations that tribes may be approaching, be willing to listen. Even if a tribe isn't federally recognized, understand and listen to the perspective in which that nation is bringing to you. And don't listen to respond, but listen to understand the perspective in which they're bringing and why it's important to them that they own that data. And the benefit to all of you at that table to listening to the tribe's perspective and respecting their authority as a nation.
Great, thank you for that, Tammy. Virginia, did you have anything else to add to that? Okay, yeah, it's a pretty comprehensive answer. And I actually had a question that came up coincidentally when we were talking about IRBs. So a conventional IRB, like the Western institutional approach to an IRB, is mostly focused on protecting like human-based patient data. And it doesn't really spend a lot of time concerning our plant and animal relatives that Native people really focus on. We're connected to just as much as we are other humans. Have you seen the importance of environmental plant animal data in tribal-led IRBs?
I haven't. Tammy, have you?
So the majority that I've seen are human subjects IRBs, but I have seen tribes begin to expand into other realms that are inclusive of all sorts of research that's happening within their nations. I know there was funding that came from, I think, HHS a number of years ago that really started these initiatives to support the development of tribal IRBs, and because it came through HHS or a health-centric organization, it was based on human subjects, but tribes are beginning to broaden it. I would be interested to see what there is through like the Department of Interior, maybe. I think there's ownership of data when it comes to like buffalo herds, especially within our Great Plains area. Yeah, so I think it's being expanded, but predominantly it's with human subjects currently.
Great. Yeah, and I think it's possibly, even though it's not a standard part of tribal IRBs, it is an important context to consider when you're working in environmental or animal-based research. Okay, here's another question, and we probably have time for maybe like one or two more questions. So does a tribe lose access to ownership of its stories and language when it shares it to be published? Maybe a silly question.
I think that's a great question. And, you know, what comes to mind for me, number one, is no, right? The answer is no. Like, you don't lose ownership of your like intellectual property, of your community owned property in terms of story, knowledge. Even when you authorize like a piece of work. So that piece about like community review, every time we do a publication, it goes back through community review. You know, when something is like formally published in this like academic world of publishing, um, you know, the intent is that we will put out information that's meaningful and helpful to other communities, right? That somebody will see research that we've done, find it helpful, and cite the publication, right? Because we live in this world where these things are important, where, you know, being published in a peer-reviewed journal is a type of rigor. And so the hope is that it's not just generalizable knowledge, but that like we're contributing to other areas in Indian country who can cite our work. So, you know, is there any control over who cites a publication? Absolutely not. You know, once something's published, anybody can cite the work, and they might cite your work in an argumentative fashion and say, you know, so and so authors state this, and we find it to be wrong for the following reasons. They might counter you. That might happen, and that's something about engaging in the world of like publishing and sort of this like academic sense of publications. So I would say there is a sense of like publicness of the information that's shared, and why tribal IRBs are really important, why review committees are really important before something is published that becomes available for public consumption, right? Like that's the piece. Like once the information's out, it's available for public consumption. So how much of this do we want to share? In terms of like, for example, health research, we might find in epidemiology that a very specific community is having an outbreak related to a sexually transmitted disease. That's information that community needs to know right away. You're having an outbreak of a sexually transmitted disease. While the report that we could issue might be really interesting, and it might show an extreme disparity between the American Indian community and another community, releasing a publicly consumable report that says this community is experiencing a sexually transmitted disease would be highly stigmatizing. And once it's left the building, once the information's left the building, it's gone. It's available for public consumption. So that is a point at which you say like, okay, a publication on this is not worth it. Like in the human subjects metrics of like what's ethical and what's unethical and what potentially is the harm. We're not only talking about like when you think about a tribal IRB, you're not only thinking about the harm to an individual, to Tammy. How might this harm Tammy? We might never know who Tammy is, but if we say something that's descriptive of Tammy enough, that will go back and be a bad reflection and be harmful to all of Oglala, then we're wrong. Like the subject there is also the community. It's not just Tammy. Someone might say, oh, there's no way when we look at this that Tammy could be harmed. A tribal IRB will say, yeah, it will, because the way in which you've described this, you're talking about the Oglala community, and your findings is going to say something about our community. And so the subject is not just at the individual level, it's at the community level.
Great, thank you so much, Virginia. I feel like there's been so much insight provided from both of you in this conversation. It seems like there's some more questions in the chat, and we are running low on time. So like Suzanne has suggested here, feel free to email your questions. I will drop my information in the chat, and I can try to get responses back to you, or you can post them on our Facebook. You can post them on our Facebook or our Instagram, or send messages directly to Tammy or I, because Tammy has also agreed to drop her personal or her contact information in the chat. But yes, and before we close out here, I just wanted to include a quote from another panel that is a lot like this, that was from the US Indigenous Data Network, and which Tanel Marley, a member of the White Mountain Apache tribe and assistant professor of American Indian Studies at Arizona State University, commented that for Native communities, political sovereignty depends on our cultural sovereignty. And as we know, Native people have always been scientists, and our data is so much more than just our diabetes rates, high school graduation rates, or poverty rates. Our data is our culture. It is our songs, our stories, our ways of stewarding the earth. And so I just want everybody to take some time to marinate on that idea as we close out this amazing talk, and just carry that with you through the rest of your day and try to think about it a little bit. Thank you all so much for being here at this panel. Thank you both to our wonderful panelists. This has been such a great experience for me, and I'm sure it's been a great experience for everybody that's logged in today or is watching on our live stream. Thank you both so much. Thank you.
Thanks, Maddie. I appreciate it.